Press talking about the elections today. What are they actually saying then, Elena?
Well, Al Aram says today, one of the leading Egyptian papers, that lots of voters think they're going to the polls today to end the military's involvement in politics, to create a civilian government for the first time in Egypt's recent history. But will this really happen? Given how much influence the military wield, they say it looks unlikely. There's no constitution, of course. The different political actors in Egypt couldn't come to an agreement to write a new constitution. So there's no definition of what the new president's powers will be. It's a completely blurred role. He doesn't quite know what he will be doing, which means, of course, the military can continue to pull strings from behind the scenes if they want to, the newspaper says. They even interview a former head of Mubarak's intelligence services who says he thinks that if the result of the election is not to the military's liking, they could actually carry out a coup d'etat and reinstall themselves in power, which is quite a shocking thing to say, considering how much political change we've already seen in Egypt in recent months. Now, that paper, Al Aram, backs Amr Moussa. They come out and say that he's the best candidate. Of course, he was, close to Mubarak, so he's not exactly a revolutionary candidate, but they reckon he's the best candidate for stability and peace in Egypt. The more left-leaning Egypt Independent, though, really reckons there's no good options among all of these candidates. They talk to a number of young revolutionaries, well, not just young, but people of all ages and classes that descended onto the streets and protested in Tahrir Square and took part in that movement to push out Hosni Mubarak, and they're all saying, we're just going for the least bad option because none of the candidates we feel we can really believe in. Some say they're going for Abdul Futu because he's the candidate that's furthest away from the Mubarak regime, so to signify a clean break, they think that's the best option. Others going for Ahmed Moussa because they're worried about the glowing influence of Islamism in Egyptian politics, but none of them in that article feeling very enthusiastic about their choice of candidate.
What about the press outside Egypt? Are they any more enthusiastic?
Well, the New York Times says it's not really ideology or Islamism or political issues that really worry the Egyptians. It's crime. They say that under Mubarak there was very little worry about crime because the regime was so repressive that people were put off committing crimes, whereas now there are lots of women complaining about sexual assaults by taxi cab drivers on public transport. Parts of the Cairo ring road are too dangerous to drive around because there's been so many carjackings. There's a spate of kidnappings and bank robberies. So that's what most concerns people. Some of them even feeling nostalgic for the Mubarak regime because at least they kept crime under control, whereas now it seems to be spiralling. So the people that the New York Times correspondent has spoken to just want a candidate that can put a tough hand to control the security situation. The Atlantic, for their part, is looking at the role of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is becoming rather complicated because the candidate they've picked, Mohamed Morsi, is so unpopular. It looks like the country's slickest political machine might not even get through to the second round of this presidential election. And some of the Muslim Brotherhood actually don't want their supporters to vote for him because they don't reckon that it would suit them because he probably won't win. They actually would prefer an Amr Moussa presidency because at least they know who Moussa is, he's a known quantity, they can get on with him, whereas Abdul Futu, the other leading candidate, is a defector from the Muslim Brotherhood, so they're not keen to see him win, even though he's the most Islamist leading candidate.
OK, well, let's change the subject completely. We're going to go to Canada now. Don't do that often on the press review, but have a look at the Canadian press. This is student demonstrations.
We don't often. I was ticked off by a Canadian colleague for not having mentioned this before.
Quite right too.
Let's have a look at the student demonstrations in Quebec and how they've gone down with the local paper. The Québécois paper Le Devoir says that the local government has started a dangerous precedent by clamping down so tightly on these student demonstrations, who of course have been marching for months to complain about tuition fees. The police have cracked down, and the paper says the Parliament should learn something from the demonstrators, who at least are standing up for their freedom of speech. But the Toronto-based paper, the Globe and Mail, an Anglophone paper, is much less complimentary. They say the Canadian students are Canada's Greeks. In other words, they think they're entitled to the state doing everything for them, and if it's not going to pay for their tuition fees, they think they've got the right to take to the streets and complain about it. That's not the Canadian way, they say. We're not in France, and certainly not in Greece. And the Montreal Gazette, another local paper, says that the Quebec public, though, while the Toronto Globe and Mail doesn't back the protesters, people in Quebec generally do, so this could lead to the downfall of the state premier Jean Charest.
And 15 seconds to mention an underreported consequence of the weekend's earthquake in Italy.
Yes, The Guardian is reporting on frantic efforts to save the year's production of parmesan after a lot of... it is important. After a lot of warehouses were brought down at dairies across the Parma region, there's a panic to try and stop all of this year's cheese going mouldy. They're having to build emergency refrigerators to try and keep it safe for this year.
Hope they manage it. I like my parmesan. It's good stuff, isn't it? Elena, thanks very much. Elena, international papers here on France 24. Reminder of the